This is Dr.RED Panda.
Did you know? The earliest prostitutes were not looked down upon. They were worshipped as living embodiments of the goddess. In ancient Babylon and Mesopotamia, prostitutes held a sacred status. Sex was not shameful, it was a ritual to connect with the divine. Every encounter was a blessing, and every prostitute could be seen as carrying the will of the gods. I'm Dr. Red Panda, and today, we'll explore how such a sacred role eventually vanished and uncover the mysterious history of prostitution. The sacred beginning. In the earliest civilizations, prostitutes were far from the marginalized figures we often imagine today. In ancient Babylon and Mesopotamia, they held a position of remarkable reverence. These women, often called sacred prostitutes, were believed to be living embodiments of the goddess, acting as intermediaries between the divine and humanity. Their role was not merely sexual, it was deeply spiritual. Every act, every encounter was considered a form of devotion, a ritual through which the gods could communicate with the mortal world. In ancient Mesopotamia, temples dedicated to goddesses like Inanna or Ishtar employed women whose role was to perform ritualized sexual acts. But here's the thing, it wasn't seen as shameful at all. In fact, it was respected. These women could hold real influence in their communities, and even kings might take part in ceremonies with them, hoping to gain divine blessings. Not every sacred prostitute served in the same way. Some worked full-time in the temple, while others only participated during holy festivals. But they all shared one belief: that sexuality wasn't sinful. Instead, it was sacred, a direct connection to the divine. In their eyes, physical intimacy wasn't just desire. It was part of a cosmic purpose. However, life for these women was not entirely free from risk. While revered, they were also bound by strict rules and rituals. Failure to adhere to ceremonial protocols could result in punishment, and their societal status, though high in the religious context, did not always translate to personal freedom. Still, compared to later historical periods, these women enjoyed a level of respect and influence unimaginable to most sex workers in later centuries. It is staggering to consider that in a time when our modern societies often equate sex with shame, there existed a world where it was a path to divine connection. The sacred prostitutes of Babylon and Mesopotamia were, in a sense, spiritual pioneers, using their bodies to bridge the human and the divine. But this era of reverence would not last forever. The forces of cultural change, shifting religious ideologies, and the rise of more restrictive moral codes would eventually erode their esteemed position, transforming the perception of prostitutes from sacred to scandalous. A shift that would echo through history. Pleasure in Greece and Rome. As history moved from the sacred temples of Mesopotamia to the bustling cities of ancient Greece and Rome, the role of prostitutes underwent a fascinating transformation. While the spiritual dimension of sex diminished, its social and political significance expanded dramatically. In these classical civilizations, prostitutes were no longer intermediaries between gods and humans. They became integral figures in the complex web of social life, commerce, and even politics. In ancient Greece, prostitutes were categorized into different classes, each with distinct privileges and expectations. At the lowest tier were the pornai, street-level workers who served the everyday citizen, often without social protection and constantly at risk of exploitation. Above them were the hetaira, elite companions who combined beauty, intelligence, and social grace. These women were not just entertainers, they were educated, cultured, and able to engage in intellectual discourse with philosophers, politicians, and wealthy patrons. Unlike many free women, the hetaira enjoyed a degree of autonomy, choosing their clients and negotiating their terms. Rome inherited and expanded upon this system. The empire's prostitutes ranged from humble street workers to high-class courtesans who frequented the villas of senators and generals. Here, sex was entwined with influence. A well-connected courtesan could gain access to political secrets, sway decisions, and even shape public opinion. In a society where patronage and relationships often determine power, a prostitute could wield subtle yet remarkable influence. Despite their integration into social life, prostitutes in Greece and Rome were not universally respected. They occupied a paradoxical space, desired and utilized yet morally suspect. Laws regulated their activities, and public opinion oscillated between admiration for their wit and condemnation for their profession. Nevertheless, their presence was ubiquitous, from the bustling marketplaces to the elegant symposiums where philosophers debated, wine flowed, and courtesans engaged in both conversation and intimacy. Sex, in these civilizations, was far more than private pleasure. It was a tool, a currency, and a social lubricant. The elite courtesans of Greece and Rome demonstrate that sexuality could confer influence, knowledge, and opportunity, blurring the lines between pleasure, power, and politics. They were entertainers, confidants, and sometimes even advisors, all roles impossible for most women in that era. Yet, beneath the glamour, there remained an undercurrent of danger and stigma. Street-level workers faced poverty and violence, while even the sophisticated Hittite had to carefully navigate the precarious balance between autonomy and social censure. Still, compared to later centuries, Greek and Roman prostitutes occupied a unique position in human history. Their sexuality was a social asset, not merely a moral concern. In these ancient cities, pleasure and politics were inseparable, and prostitutes stood at the intersection. Their lives reveal a complex society where sex could be sacred, strategic, and scandalous all at once, setting the stage for the moral conflicts that would arise in the centuries to come. The medieval paradox. With the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity, the role of prostitutes entered a period of profound contradiction. Sex, once entwined with social influence or spiritual devotion, became largely framed as sin. The Church preached strict moral codes, emphasizing chastity and the suppression of desire. Yet, paradoxically, prostitutes did not disappear. They were tolerated, regulated, and in some cases even overseen by religious authorities. In medieval Europe, urban centers often maintained designated areas for prostitution, commonly known as red light districts. Town councils and the church recognized the necessary evil of prostitution. It was believed that providing outlets for male desire would prevent greater sins, such as adultery or sexual violence against women of respectable status. In this sense, prostitutes were both condemned and essential, a living embodiment of society's conflicted morality. Prostitutes in this period were stratified, much like their ancient predecessors. Street-level workers faced harsh living conditions and social disdain, while brothel-managed women, particularly in cities like Paris, Florence, or London, operated under official licenses and were subjected to rules regarding health, conduct, and taxation. In some cases, the church directly intervened, ensuring that brothels met sanitary standards and that the women complied with moral oversight. This created a bizarre situation. Women engaged in sin were simultaneously under religious protection. The paradox extended to culture and literature. Medieval texts often depicted prostitutes as both morally corrupt and clever, dangerous yet desirable. They appear in morality plays, poetry, and chronicles, reflecting society's fascination with sexuality even as it sought to suppress it. Their very existence was a reminder of the tension between human desire and divine expectation. At the same time, prostitutes occasionally held economic influence. Brothel owners and courtesans could amass wealth, negotiate better terms, and occasionally gain indirect political leverage through their clients. Yet, despite these opportunities, social stigma was ever present. A single misstep could result in banishment, public shaming, or imprisonment, highlighting the precarious balance they navigated between utility and disgrace. The medieval era illustrates a society struggling to reconcile faith and desire. Prostitutes were caught in this moral crossfire, necessary for the functioning of urban life, yet constantly reminded of their supposed sinfulness. Their paradoxical status, condemned, tolerated, and sometimes regulated by the very institutions that preached against them, set the stage for the harsher stigmatization and criminalization that would dominate the early modern period. In this complex era, prostitutes were mirrors of societal contradictions, a reminder that human desire cannot be fully suppressed, even under the weight of religious and legal authority. Their story reveals how morality, power, and survival intertwined in ways both practical and deeply ironic. The early modern darkness. As Europe transitioned into the early modern era, from the Renaissance through the Enlightenment, the status of prostitutes shifted once again, this time toward deeper marginalization and stigma. What had once been tolerated, even managed by religious or civic authorities, became increasingly criminalized and pathologized. Prostitution, rather than being seen as a necessary evil, was cast as a direct threat to public health, morality, and social order. Governments began to enact stricter regulations, pushing sex work into hidden corners of society. Licensed brothels that had once operated openly under municipal or church oversight were closed, while women accused of prostitution were often forced into confinement or subjected to public humiliation. The new emphasis was on control, surveillance, and punishment. Prostitutes became targets of moral reformers who linked them with vice, decay, and, above all, disease. The spread of syphilis in the 15th and 16th centuries intensified this negative image. As the Great Pox ravaged Europe, prostitutes were blamed as its primary carriers. Medical treatises, political decrees, and religious sermons depicted them as vectors of contagion, walking symbols of sin and corruption. The earlier perception of prostitutes as fulfilling a social function collapsed, replaced by an association with danger and degeneration. At the same time, the growing emphasis on the nuclear family and stricter gender roles pushed prostitutes further to society's margins. Respectable women were increasingly confined to domestic spaces, expected to embody purity and obedience. Prostitutes, by contrast, represented the opposite: public, unruly, and immoral. This polarization deepened their stigmatization, turning them into social scapegoats for anxieties about sexuality, disease, and disorder. Yet, paradoxically, demand never disappeared. Cities across Europe, from London to Amsterdam to Paris, still harbored thriving, though often hidden, sex industries. Elite courtesans occasionally managed to carve out spheres of influence, using charm and discretion to attract powerful patrons. But for the vast majority, life was harsh. Poverty, abuse, and exploitation defined their daily existence. Many were arrested, confined in institutions, or subjected to medical examinations meant to protect the public. The early modern period thus marked a profound shift. Prostitutes were no longer viewed as necessary but shameful participants in urban life. Instead, they became symbols of moral failure, blamed for society's ills and subjected to systematic oppression. The once sacred, sometimes tolerated role had turned into one of almost universal condemnation. This darkness foreshadowed the modern debates that would follow. By branding prostitutes as both criminals and outcasts, early modern societies created a legacy of stigma that lingers even today. It was a time when fear, disease, and morality converged to transform sex work into one of the most despised and persecuted professions in history. The modern legacy. Today, the story of prostitution is far from over. Across the world, sex work remains one of the most debated and controversial issues of our time. In some countries, prostitution is legalized and regulated, with advocates arguing that it protects workers' rights and health. In others, it is harshly criminalized, forcing sex workers into the shadows where they face greater risks of violence and exploitation. The contradictions we've seen throughout history, sacred versus sinful, necessary versus shameful, are still with us. Society cannot seem to decide. Are sex workers victims to be rescued, criminals to be punished, or professionals deserving respect? The answer depends not only on laws but on cultural attitudes, religious traditions, and economic realities. What is clear, however, is that sex work continues to mirror humanity's deepest conflicts about morality, desire, and power. It raises uncomfortable questions. Should sex ever be treated as a commodity? Does criminalization protect society? Or does it endanger the very people it claims to save? And perhaps most importantly, it challenges us to reflect on our own judgments. When we look at the history of prostitution, We are really looking at the history of how societies have struggled, again and again, to control desire while denying its inevitability. So, what do you think? Should prostitution be legalized worldwide, regulated like any other profession? Or does that cross a moral line that society should never normalize? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because this history isn't finished. It's still being written right now. And that's a wrap for this episode of the video. I'm DR.RED Panda. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Until next time, take care.